Hey guys, tonight we drift into one of the most unnerving true encounters ever reported at Sea On event that began with a simple radio call and unraveled into something no maritime protocol could explain. The headlines read, "Ghost signal startles vessels in the Strait of Malacca, and vanished freighter sends midnight SOS 15 years later." But these weren't tabloids. These were logs and transcripts pulled straight from vessels crossing one of the busiest and most surveilled waterways in the world. It was 041, a humid and windless night over the Strait of Malacca. The cargo vessel Rostal Tiger, en route from Jakarta to Singapore, had just adjusted course to avoid traffic. The bridge crew was going through their standard checklist when a static-ridden voice cut through Channel 16, the international distress frequency. Sierra, Papa, Hotel, 421, Mayday, engine failure, taking on water. A familiar cadence, calm, professional. But something about it sent a chill down the first officer's spine. The captain turned, immediately ordering the radio officer to repeat the message. It came again, less distorted this time. ZPH-421, position, north 5 degrees 10, east 99 degrees 12. Require immediate assistance. That call sign ZPH-421 didn't match any active vessels in the area. The crew checked the AIS, Automatic Identification System, and radar overlay. Nothing. No ship by that ID. No distress beacon. No transponder ping. Only their own vessel in the usual traffic lanes. But the position given, it did exist. And it was oddly specific, roughly 11 nautical miles to the northeast, near a shallow known for unpredictable currents and sediment traps. It was also the exact location where the Zéphyr, a container ship registered under the same call sign, had disappeared 15 years earlier without a trace. Back then, it had been a mystery with no answers. The Zéphyr had left Penang en route to Port Klang in April 2007 with a full cargo manifest and 23 crew. It never arrived. No emergency signals, no debris, no ELT, nothing. Official inquiries ruled it a presumed sinking due to unknown mechanical failure, but no wreckage was ever recovered. And neither was its voice. The Rostal Tiger's captain, adhering to maritime law, logged the message and altered course toward the coordinates. They weren't alone. 3 other ships in nearby lanes also reported hearing the same signal at the same moment, some with clearer reception, yet none picked up any visual on radar or scope. As Rostal Tiger approached the grid square, the sea remained calm. No oil slick, no flares, but their onboard radar started to flicker. Briefly, just for seconds, it registered an object to port, rectangular, moving slowly against the current. Then gone. The radio officer raised his mic and attempted a direct hail. "This is MV Rostal Tiger, hailing ZPH-421. Do you copy?" A pause. Then a faint click, followed by static. And then manifest, secure, crew, awaiting extraction. After that, silence. By 1:12, the signal vanished. No further response was received. The radar flicker didn't return. At sunrise, a Malaysian patrol vessel arrived to sweep the area. They found nothing. No ship, no wreckage, no debris. The sea was empty. But the strangest detail would come days later. when the international maritime communication logs from that night were reviewed. ZPH-421 had not only broadcasted a standard SOS, it had included proper formatting, correct channel usage, and a timestamp synchronized to 2007 protocol, including an outdated code prefix last used 15 years ago. This wasn't just a hoax. Whoever or whatever was transmitting had been frozen in time. Was it an echo? A pirate transmission using ghost credentials? Or something else? Something still drifting out there? Historians of maritime anomalies were quick to point out that the Strait of Malacca has long been a place where navigation instruments behave oddly. Magnetic interference, vanishing radar echoes, ships that show up briefly on charts, then vanish. But nothing had ever replicated an entire distress call from a vessel officially lost. And here's the cold part. ZPH-421's last known transmission before it vanished in 2007 also mentioned engine failure and water ingress. The message heard in 2022 was word for word identical, except for one difference. The 2022 message ended with a line not present in the archived version: "Crew, awaiting extraction." It wasn't a request, it was a statement. The name Zéphyr, or as it appeared in radio shorthand, ZPH-421, had barely surfaced in maritime conversation for over a decade. It had become one of those quiet tragedies of the sea. A cargo vessel presumed sunk, its crew mourned but never truly buried. Its story left open, ended in dusty files. But in the wake of the midnight signal, everything changed. Within 48 hours of that eerie broadcast, regional maritime authorities reopened the Zéphyr case file, formally classified in 2008 as missing at sea, no physical evidence. The cargo manifest, last known coordinates, maintenance logs, and weather reports from the date of disappearance were pulled from archives in Port Klang and digitized for urgent review. What the documents revealed wasn't shocking, but it did feel unfinished. The Zéphyr was built in 1982, Panamanian flagged, operated out of Singapore, and had been leased under a quiet but recurring arrangement to various state and corporate entities. At the time of its disappearance in 2007, it was on a charter for a Malaysian private consortium. The manifest listed standard containers, textiles, appliances, industrial spares. But there were redactions. 3 entries on the manifest bore a simple mark: T01 secure. And in the original inspection reports logged at Penang, one container had a separate seal verification procedure. The container's listed weight and assigned contents were left blank. Curious, but not necessarily alarming. At least not then. And so the working theory had always been mechanical failure. But what never sat right with investigators was the absence of any debris. No life rafts, no cargo washed ashore, no distress beacons. Ships don't just vanish, they break apart. They leave behind a trail. Except when they don't. The crew of the Zéphyr included 23 people: Indonesian sailors, a Filipino chief engineer, 2 British technicians listed as external consultants, and a Singaporean captain named Tan Wei Ren. According to his service record, Tan had been at sea for over 30 years. He was known for being pragmatic, composed, and curiously obsessed with weather phenomena. One of his final logged communications, hours before the ship went silent, was a direct request to reroute slightly north, to avoid atmospheric anomalies. That phrase raised eyebrows even in the original investigation. Back in 2007, they had dismissed it as caution, perhaps, an approaching storm cell. But here's where things get stranger. In the days leading up to its disappearance, Zéphyr was tracked via standard AIS beacons. It maintained steady speed and bearing. No known storms, no piracy alerts. But there were several brief transmission blackouts periods of 2 to 4 minutes, occurring once every few hours, where the ship's location and signal simply blinked out. At the time, these were attributed to minor equipment glitches. But in light of the recent ghost transmission, these blackouts took on a new meaning. Why? Because the modern cargo ship Rostel Tiger, which intercepted ZPH-421 signal, reported its own AIS flickered at the exact same intervals when approaching the position given in the distress call, almost as if there was a pattern. Maritime historians, especially those familiar with the lore of the Malacca Strait, began whispering of repeat echo anomalies, a term usually relegated to fringe sonar discussions. The idea is that, under certain unknown conditions, a ship's electromagnetic signature might bounce back into detectable range after vanishing. It's unproven, but many captains quietly believe in it. Then came the satellite data. A week after the event, Japan's NTT Spacewatch program released a set of low-orbit thermal snapshots of the Strait. Most showed nothing unusual, but one image taken exactly 6 minutes after the distress signal showed a faint heat ghost silhouette. The shape matched the Zephyr's hull dimensions, heading northeast. But this was impossible. Not only had the ship supposedly been lost for 15 years, but the direction it moved would have placed it against the current with no engine heat signature. And yet there it was. When asked to explain it, one analyst from Tokyo said flatly, "We're not saying it was a ship, but whatever it was, it moved like one." So now investigators were stuck between conflicting truths. The radio message came through on a dead ship's call sign. The coordinates matched the last known position. The message was word for word with the 2007 version, except for one added phrase, "Crew awaiting extraction." And then there was this. A 2008 internal note found in the original investigation log, written in the margin by a junior officer. It said, "Feels like we're investigating something that hasn't happened yet." It was dismissed back then. A strange comment, maybe even a joke. But now it reads like a premonition, because something had begun, and somehow it had started in the middle. The Strait of Malacca has always been a paradox, one of the world's most heavily trafficked maritime corridors and one of the most haunted in modern seafaring folklore. Stretching over 800 kilometers between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, this narrow waterway sees over 100,000 ships pass through each year. But what rarely makes it into the charts or shipping forecasts are the tales murmured in mess halls and radio rooms, especially those that begin after midnight. The sudden reemergence of ZPH-421's distress signal reopened a vault of stories that many captains knew, but few dared to put in writing. And as news of the signals spread through shipping circles and old-timers' forums, one word came up again and again: the drifters. This term referred to a peculiar type of maritime sighting, long whispered about along the Strait. They were vessels glimpsed from a distance, often described as black or gray silhouettes, not responding to hails, not listed on AIS, and always vanishing within minutes. Some appeared in fog, others beneath a clear moon. But one detail was eerily consistent. They moved against the current. Officially, maritime authorities have never acknowledged these sightings as credible. But dig deep enough, and you find fragments. In 1993, a Singaporean patrol craft recorded an unregistered freighter appearing and disappearing 3 times within a 10-minute window. The radar image was printed and filed, annotated with the words, "Echo disruption possibly caused by trawler debris." But the crew, in private debriefs, described something else. A full-sized ship with no lights, no wake, and a hull that looked war era. In 2001, a Thai fishing vessel swore it nearly collided with a drifting ship near Pulau Parakex, except it vanished right before impact. The crew was so shaken they refused to return to sea for weeks. The captain's log was confiscated by port authorities, and the story was never officially recorded. And yet, despite these anomalies, the Strait has remained navigableno different from any other contested waterway. Until now. What makes the Zéphyr case different isn't just the signal, or the confirmed call sign, or the corroborating radar echoes. It's that this time, multiple ships received the same message at the same time with matching coordinates. This wasn't a hallucination or a lonely mariner's myth. It was logged, repeated, verified. And yet, for those familiar with local lore, it only confirmed what had been whispered for generations, that the Strait of Malacca is home to more than currents and commerce. It holds memory. Some say it's the confluence of geographies, where tectonic plates grind, fault lines ripple, and electromagnetic fields spike unpredictably. Others believe it's cultural, a place of too much history, too many wars, too many unrecorded tragedies sinking into the seabed. Take, for example, the legend of the Lanoon ship. This tale has persisted since the 18th century, describing a vessel crewed by Malay pirates who vanished into mist during a British chase, only to be seen decades later drifting silently, unchanged, flags tattered, but never falling. Reports of the ship span from 1,821 to 1,987. Always seen, never caught. Or the story of the Dutch merchant ship Noorvoik, which in 1892 was reportedly found floating adrift, sails intact, cargo undisturbed, its entire crew missing, dinner plates still warm. Its last log entry: moonlight on water tonight, silence too thick to bear. Some folklorists believe the Strait acts as a temporal anomaly, a phrase that sounds more like science fiction than oceanography. But what they mean is this: time seems to behave oddly here. A few documented incidents have described lost minutes, sudden compass drift, even stars that appear out of alignment. Could the Zéphyr have fallen into one of these bends? The idea isn't without precedent, at least in theory. During World War II, Allied submarines reported strange sonar distortions in the Strait. One declassified British naval report from 1945 describes a moment where our signal echoed back before transmission, an impossibility that was chalked up to equipment malfunction. But the most compelling anecdote came from a retired Indonesian navigator who, when asked about the Zéphyr, simply said, "Ah, that ship, it did not sink, it slipped." "Slipped?" "When pressed," he explained in Bahasa, "some ships sink, some drift, and some slip through what the water remembers." It's a poetic phrase, but it echoes something chilling, that the sea, like time, remembers differently. As word of ZPH-421's reappearance continued to spread, more sailors began to come forward. Stories that had been buried in notebooks, dismissed by captains, or quietly forgotten were surfacing again. Descriptions of ships seen from a distance, calling out in dead languages. Lights that didn't reflect on water, hulls with registration numbers that had been retired decades ago. To some, it was mass coincidence. To others, a reckoning. But to those who had sailed the Strait at night, there was only one word left: return. Because in the stories that came before, one truth kept surfacing. They always come back. Not for long, but just enough to remind us they were real. At 2:08 a.m. local time, the Port Authority of Singapore's Vessel Traffic Management System flagged a Category 3 anomalia radar target that moved erratically and failed to emit any AIS signal. The contact appeared near waypoint Delta 7, just northeast of Pulau Jurak. It lasted for precisely 4 minutes and 37 seconds, then vanished. Normally, such anomalies are dismissed as phantom echoes caused by overlapping signals, distant storm interference, or stray reflections from the coastline. But this case was different. The radar data captured a fully formed vessel outline with dimensions that matched exactly to a ship once declared lost. The Zéphyr, this was not speculation. The digital print matched the archival hull profile pulled from 2006 maintenance records 122 meters long, 21 meters wide, flat-bowed. There was even a faint secondary blip suggesting a smaller object trailing behind it, possibly a detached lifeboat or buoyant container. But there were no wakes, no engine sounds, and no heat signature. The Port Authority's standard protocol flagged the occurrence as an echo drift, a term used for radar contacts that move too smoothly and vanish without cross-confirmation. But this time, it wasn't the only record. Two commercial ships nearby, MV Artemis Ray and SS Windflower, independently reported brief electromagnetic interference on their communication systems during that window. Their navigational instruments wobbled, adjusted, then returned to normal. The captain of the Artemis Ray noted a chilling addition. For approximately 90 seconds, their radio picked up a faint, looped voice, repeating only a few words. Cargo secured. Engines failing. Extraction pending. Looped. Not live. Like a message caught in replay. When the shipping logs from 2007 were pulled again, something clicked. In the Zéphyr's last known contact, those words had been spoken almost verbatim right, down to the phrasing, but the recording picked up in 2022 carried a minor delay, as though it were being retransmitted, like an old record needle stuck just before the chorus. This is where Maritime engineers stepped in. They began to investigate the anomaly through the lens of electromagnetic propagation theory, that under certain rare conditions, radio waves can bounce off layers of the ionosphere and return years later as ghost echoes. Known as long-delayed echoes, or LDEs, they are rare but documented. Usually, these are fragments lasting milliseconds. But this was minutes long, coordinated, and directional. One specialist from Japan's Maritime Research Institute posed a radical question in a closed briefing. What if what we're receiving isn't a wave trapped in time, but a ship trapped in a loop? A loop. The word caught on quickly among those reviewing the data. Some proposed it was a feedback of the original signal, caught in a rare meteorological or magnetospheric condition. Others argued it was something stranger in active transmission trying to break through. Then came a detail no one had expected. A freelance tech operator from Sumatra, scanning the open frequency logs on his personal SDR, software-defined radio, uploaded a screen recording showing repeating pings, not audio, but digital pulses, time-stamped and spaced every 7.8 seconds. It resembled a handshake signal, like the kind older ships used when trying to sync with a communication satellite. The problem? That protocol had been retired since 2009, and the only ship still known to have the onboard module for that ping system? The Zéphyr-class freighters, built between 1980 and 1985. At this point, the incident moved beyond the realm of simple anomaly. A multinational task force began assembling fragments radio intercepts, radar logs, infrared scans, and compiled them into what was tentatively labeled the Zéphyr pulse pattern. It became clear, whatever was out there was emitting an intelligent, structured signal, not random, not natural, repeating, trying, but for what? Theories ranged wildly. Some engineers believed the ship was broadcasting on loop due to a mechanical fault triggered in a moment of pre-sinking trauma. Others speculated it had entered a magnetogravitational pakata, kind of spatial sinkhole, where time and signal behave differently. The academic community was divided. One theoretical physicist remarked, "We might not be seeing a ghost ship. We might be seeing a glitch in oceanic memory where past and present fold over like damp paper. Romantic, but still speculative." And yet, the reality remained. A missing ship had spoken again, not once, not randomly, but systematically, across separate instruments and vessels. One Malaysian operator put it plainly, "It's like something is still out there, trying to finish the last message." A message caught in the folds of time, or maybe a ship that never truly left. In a coastal cafe near Bergen, Norway, Captain Arvid Loken sat across from two maritime investigators, holding a thin plastic case in his weathered hands. Inside it, wound neatly on a labeled spool, was a mini DV tape from his personal collection dated the 11th of December, 2022 Strait transit. This tape contained a recording, not of a sighting, but of something far stranger, a conversation. With a ship that no longer existed, Captain Loken, skipper of the MV Sandefjord, was transiting through the southern corridor of the Malacca Strait that night, bound for Sri Lanka. His crew logged nothing unusual at first: calm weather, steady radar, moderate traffic. Then, just after 1:50 a.m., a voice broke through Channel 16, the international hailing frequency, ZPH-421, to any nearby vessels. Engines failing. Cargo secured. Need guidance. Loken, expecting a prank or rogue operator, responded. His radio officer, a 20-year veteran, immediately began recording the feed on both digital and analog channels. Was protocol in case of piracy or SAR documentation. What followed was a full 2 minutes and 17 seconds of bidirectional communication. I read you, ZPH 421. Please confirm your vessel name and position. A pause. This is the Zéphyr. Repeat. ZM Fear. Position north 510, east 9912. Propulsion lost. Holding minimal steerage. The coordinates matched the ones logged in the midnight SOS report. Loken pressed further. Zéphyr, be advised, your vessel is marked inactive since 2007. Can you confirm number of crew aboard? Static cracked, followed by something that sent chills through the room. A calm male voice replied, 23 souls manifest, all accounted, awaiting instructions. That was the official number of crew listed on the Zephyr's last voyage. And that phrase, souls manifest, was old maritime terminology, rarely used in modern radio reports. The exchange ended when the voice simply repeated, extraction pending, then silence. Loken and his officer stared at the receiver, waiting. The radar showed no blips. A's still empty. Thermal scope blank, and yet the voice had been clear, its signal strength indicating close proximity, likely within 10 kilometers. The most unsettling part? The voice never asked for help. It only stated conditions, almost like it didn't know how much time had passed. When Loken's team submitted the recording to maritime authorities, it was initially met with skepticism. But after authentication, the transmission's timestamp, frequency signature, and metadata aligned perfectly with other logs from the same night. It was real. More eerie still. The voice modulation profile matched archival recordings of Captain Tanway Wren, the original commander of the Zéphyr. This wasn't a hoax. It was a mirror from the past. Linguists brought in to study the tape noted the calm tone, lack of urgency, and use of steerage rather than rudder control, terms more common in older naval parlance. One even noted that the voice's stress pattern and sentence construction suggested routine broadcast behavior, not distress improvisation. Which raises a chilling question. Was Captain Tan even aware that 15 years had passed? To many in the maritime community, this moment marked a shift. It was no longer about ghosts or echoes. Something was responding, interacting, and aware at least partially of its own situation. But even more mysterious was what came next. The mini DV tape, upon forensic scanning, contained embedded sub-audio pulses short, rhythmic bursts in the ultrasonic range, too faint for human ears, too structured to be random noise. Experts believed it might be a data handshakia-coded attempt to transmit beyond voice. Though undeciphered, this implied an attempt at multimodal communication. A single vessel, believed lost for over a decade, was now emitting structured data and responding coherently in human voice. And yet, when the MV Sandefjord passed through the exact coordinates minutes later, there was nothing. No wake, no wreckage, no ship. Only the silence of a sea that had begun to whisper again. At a closed seminar on maritime anomalies in Kuala Lumpur, an academic posed a disturbing hypothesis. What if the Zéphyr didn't sink? What if it became trapped not in water, but in time itself? A poetic idea, but in this case, one grounded in data. For Captain Loken, the moment is still clear as day. As he told the press, "I wasn't scared, not exactly, but I felt like I was speaking to a ship that didn't know it was gone." The seabed beneath the Strait of Malacca hides more than forgotten anchors, and coral reefs it conceals decades, even centuries, of wrecks, whispers, and wreckage. But in the last few years, attention has quietly returned to one very specific coordinate grid, nestled near a sediment shelf southwest of Pulau Perak. This is where, in 2019, a team of researchers from the University of Malaya conducted a marine magnetic anomaly survey initially designed to study underwater fault lines and tectonic drift. But what they discovered, hidden beneath 40 meters of silt and coarse sediment, was something that did not match the expected geological pattern. It was metallic, rectangular, and unnaturally symmetrical. Initially catalogued as Object M12, the anomaly was believed to be remnants of an old cargo ship, maybe Japanese, possibly colonial era. But the magnetic signature was unusual. Instead of fading with depth and density, it pulsed faintly, irregularly, like a heartbeat. By chance, one of the researchers on that 2019 expedition had also worked on a maritime mapping project in 2007, the year the Zéphyr disappeared. And when he overlaid the old distress coordinates with the present magnetic maps, they aligned almost perfectly. More tests were ordered, more scans, and a pattern emerged. Every 7 to 9 days, the magnetic intensity would spike for exactly 6 minutes, then fade. The rhythm was not consistent with undersea cable current or seismic activity, nor did it match known shipwreck decay signatures. What it did resemble, strangely, was a broadcast signal's harmonic signature, distorted by water density. The research team submitted these findings under a generic title, Localized EM Anomalies in the Perak Sediment Shelf. But word quietly spread, and soon independent salvage crews began arriving in the region, claiming interest in wreck archaeology. In reality, several were equipped with advanced sonar gear, typically reserved for deep ocean recovery. One crew, known only by its shell company Arden Marine Logistics, dropped a submersible in late 2022. They never published their findings. But a leak from one of their contracted drone operators included a still frame, a murky outline, unmistakably a cargo vessel, lying at an angle, partially embedded in the silt. The shape was consistent with the Zéphyr. But here's where it gets strange. The vessel bore no signs of corrosion, no visible hull breaches, and most startling of all, the nameplate illuminated by the submersible's light appeared polished, not worn down, not faded. It simply read, Zéphyr, when confronted, Arden Marine spokesperson denied all findings. Claimed the still frame was fabricated, but internal customs logs showed their submersible made 4 more dives within 3 weeks, all at the same site. This suggested they found something they hadn't expected, or something they didn't want to explain. Meanwhile, Malaysian naval authorities quietly restricted sonar scans in the region, citing environmental protection concerns. A convenient shield, and yet nearby fishermen began to report unusual compass behavior. Boats would drift subtly northeast, regardless of wind. Nets tangled inexplicably. Some claimed their GPS units looped or reset without warning. What do we make of a ship embedded in sediment with no decay, broadcasting signals 15 years after it vanished? Historians were at a loss. One oceanographer suggested that if the ship were indeed preserved so perfectly, it must have existed outside normal entropy conditions for years and somehow returned. He admitted, off record, if what we're seeing is real, the Zéphyr may not have stayed in our timeline continuously. Another researcher drew parallels to magnetoreception, biological trait in migratory animals that allows them to sense Earth's magnetic field. Some researchers speculate that strong distortions in this field could affect not just instruments, but the perception of time and space, especially in confined metal environments like a ship's hull. Of course, the scientific community is split. Some still argue the data was misread, that the submersible feed was altered. But the fact remains, something metallic, intact, and almost certainly named Zéphyr lies at the bottom of the strait, and it is not silent. Because just weeks after the dive, the pulses changed, not in frequency, but in tone. No longer uniform, but varied, as if responding. And then, the clearest message yet. A brief burst of Morse code received on a civilian scanning network in Langkawi. Translated, it read, "Manifest stable. Extraction awaiting coordinates." The same phrase, but different word order. A signal not stuck on repeat, but one that is learning to rephrase. It no longer sounded like a loop. It sounded like a dialogue. Long before the name Zéphyr became synonymous with mystery, the ship had already lived a double life on that few outside the shipping and defense industries ever knew. Though publicly registered as a commercial cargo vessel, the Zéphyr had a complex ownership trail that passed quietly through offshore accounts, shell companies, and contract amendments. When investigators revisited the archived documents following the strange 2022 transmissions, they uncovered fragments of a logistical shadow behind the ship's final voyage. The most telling clue? A short clause buried in a 2006 maintenance report listing the Zéphyr's involvement in a temporary dual-use chartera term used when a vessel operates both commercially and for governmental or paramilitary objectives. This wasn't unheard of, particularly for ships traversing geopolitically tense waters. But the Zéphyr's assignment came from an unexpected source. A joint defense initiative operating between 3 Southeast Asian nations and allegedly backed by a private technology consortium headquartered in Zurich. Its purpose? Transport of what was vaguely referred to as a non-civilian navigation array. To most, that means nothing. But to naval engineers and satellite analysts, the term raised eyebrows. A navigation array isn't just GP-SIT, can include sensor clusters, deep-sea resonators, or even experimental spatial mapping devices. Devices that interact not only with satellites, but with the electromagnetic behavior of the ocean itself. For months prior to its final departure, the Zéphyr had been docked at an underreported facility in Batam, Indonesia. Security logs, though incomplete, confirmed the arrival of two unmarked containers, loaded at night and sealed with serialized locks. Official customs entries listed them as climate-controlled electrical modules. But accompanying documents now partially declassified show notations of magnetic shielding, quantum stabilization, and restricted calibration conditions. Why would a cargo ship need to carry such components? One theory, raised quietly in academic circles, suggests that the ship was testing a geospatial array designed to map micro-anomalies, natural occurrences in the Earth's magnetic field that fluctuate by nanoseconds and can theoretically affect time synchronization systems. This may sound abstract, but here's the core idea. Time and navigation are inseparably linked. Disrupt one, and you distort the other. If the Zéphyr was carrying such an experimental payload, especially one operating near or below the sea's surface, it's possible that it accidentally triggered a spatial fold, or what some physicists refer to as a temporospatial echo. In other words, the ship might not have sunk. It might have drifted out of normal time. This isn't pure speculation. After the reemergence of ZPH-421's distress signals, one retired systems engineer who had worked for the now-defunct Zurich Consortium came forward under anonymity. His statement was brief, but chilling. It was never meant to be deployed at sea. The water distorts the frequencies too much. We warned them. Pressed for more, he only added. If it activated at the wrong time, you wouldn't know if a second had passed, or a decade. Official agencies declined to comment. But the final piece of the puzzle came not from documents or experts, but from the Zéphyr's own crew manifest. Two of the 23 listed personnel known only by their initials, May H and LK, were not sailors. Their positions were marked as Consultant External Systems, with no accompanying nationality or contact. Their personnel files were sealed, missing even passport scans or health forms. All attempts to identify their origin led nowhere. One of them, however, left behind a trace. In the belongings of the chief engineer later recovered from his family was a personal journal, mostly weather entries and notes on ship routines. But near the final pages, a strange line was scribbled beneath a torn page. MH says if it activates, don't touch the bulkhead. Frequencies may loop. This was the engineer's last entry. To this day, historians and maritime investigators still argue over what activated aboard the Zéphyr. Some believe it was simply bad time-and-gan experimental array colliding with atmospheric anomalies. Others suspect sabotage, and a few those who study strange histories whispered through trade routes believe something older was involved. Because long before GPS, before diesel engines, before map sailors once believed that certain waters could store memory, that oceans, like humans, had moments they could not let go of. And now, 15 years after its disappearance, it seems the Zéphyr is trying slowly, brokenly to return, but return from where? Ships go silent all the time. Radios fail. Signals drop. The sea doesn't care about continuity. But what troubled maritime analysts reviewing the Zéphyr case wasn't just the midnight signal. It was the strange precedents, the quiet patterns, scattered across years, that now formed a thread. Beginning in late 2008, months after the Zéphyr's presumed disappearance, several transiting vessels in the southern Malacca corridor began reporting what they called silent zone. These were brief intervals, anywhere from 3 to 12 minutes, during which communication systems would fade to static. GPS units would freeze or shift slightly. Digital compasses spun a few degrees off and slowly realigned. No shipwrecks, no storms, no obvious interference. Then, just as quickly, the systems would return to normal. The phenomenon wasn't immediately linked to the Zéphyr. After all, the Strait is notorious for its dense traffic and occasional signal congestion. Engineers blamed overlapping transponders, ionospheric conditions, or benign jamming. But the logs told a different story. When plotted on a long-term map, most of these silent zones formed an elliptical ring-a-loop, roughly 17 nautical miles in diameter, centered on the last known coordinates of ZPH-421. And here's where things got eerie. Several captains, especially those piloting older vessels with analog systems, reported that during these quiet patches, their equipment did not simply stop, it briefly reverted. One Sri Lankan freighter, the MV Sivananda, logged a peculiar event in 2012. Their mechanical depth gauge momentarily displayed an outdated measurement format imperial feet, not meter 7, though the gauge had been factory calibrated in metric since 2005. It lasted 8 seconds. No crew member had changed the settings. A Filipino oil barge, in 2015, swore that their analog radio dialed into a phantom frequency playing a Morse loop. The code translated to status intact, awaiting instruction. This matched word for word with one of the archival entries from the Zéphyr's final radio log until then, thought to be lost with the ship. But perhaps the most unsettling report came in 2018 from a small, privately operated cargo vessel, the MV Silver Nataraj. During a midnight passage through the Zéphyr corridor, their crew observed a brief silhouette on the horizon, large, unlit, motionless. They altered course. The second officer took photos using a digital camera with long exposure. At first glance, the images showed nothing but ocean haze. But when examined closely, one frame captured what appeared to be a vessel's shadow knot reflected in the water, but outlined against it. Ship dimensions matched those of the Zéphyr. When questioned later, the Silver Nataraj's captain said something that stuck with investigators. It wasn't just that we saw a ship that shouldn't be there. It was that our ship stopped making wake. The water around us went still too still. That phrase, too still, recurred in multiple logs. During every one of these signal blackouts, captains noted a strange deadening of sound, no water slap, no engine hum, no gulls. Just the kind of silence that feels heavy in the lungs. In 2022, when the Zéphyr's signal reappeared, a group of maritime archivists began compiling these reports, feeding them into a synchronized time map. The resulting data set showed something shocking. The silent intervals occurred in a 91-day cycle, roughly aligned with lunar perigee point, at which the moon is closest to Earth. Lunar influence on tides is well understood, but could it affect electromagnetic behavior at sea? Some geophysicists speculated that if the Zéphyr had been caught in a localized magnetic pocket, then lunar shifts might subtly alter that pocket's boundary field, occasionally allowing faint emissions radio waves, heat bursts, even visual echo stow leak through. It's not science fiction. In places like the Bermuda Triangle and the Devil's Sea near Japan, similar bleed-through phenomena have been documented, ships seen twice, times logged twice, instruments misaligned for no mechanical reason. Historians also pointed to older navigation lore. The Malay word hantu laut refers to spirits said to dwell in particular stretches of water, especially where currents spiral and compasses fail. The Strait of Malacca, in its southern bend, is one such place. What if the Zéphyr wasn't destroyed, but displaced? Not in space, but in the kind of subtle fold that most instruments can't detect, but the sea somehow remembers? Even more curious, none of the silent zones have occurred during daytime hours. Not once, not even under controlled test runs. Whatever's happening, it needs night, stillness, and midnight. As of now, signal mapping buoys deployed by Singapore's Maritime Board continue to record faint pulses at 02:03 a.m., precisely the time the Zéphyr sent its final logged message in 2007. No two pulses are exactly the same, but every now and then one of them matches, beat for beat. A pattern from 15 years ago. A ship that vanished. A message that keeps breathing. By the winter of 2023, maritime authorities weren't the only ones paying attention to the Zéphyr. A quiet group of independent data researchers specializing in synthetic radio anomalies began compiling all publicly available fragments transmissions, radar pings, AIS dropouts, even unexplained compass misalignments into a massive chronological lattice. The project, codenamed Project Wakeglass, initially began as a curiosity, but it quickly turned into something more. Their working hypothesis was daring. The Zéphyr wasn't merely repeating old signals. It was stuck inside a repeating architecturone that reset itself every time it was about to be found. They started with signal timestamps. Using 12 confirmed cases of strange VHF or Morse activity linked to the ZPH-421 call sign, they aligned all transmissions based on lunar cycle and tidal indexes. Something strange emerged. Each signal came exactly 13 days and 7 hours before or after a full moon. Not a random spread, not noise, a pattern. And inside that pattern, a signal curve, a single pulse, but a layered modulation, like a voice, but through waterlogged memory. With the help of open-source AI audio software and archival frequency databases, they reconstructed one of the faintest signals, a distorted message believed to be the first ever post-2007 Zéphyr echo. Hidden beneath static and reverb, a message barely audible played on loop. This is not distress. This is position. If you're hearing this, then the cycle hasn't broken. The sentence stopped mid-syllable, then restarted. The phrase, not distress, position, fascinated everyone involved. It suggested the Zéphyr wasn't sending out an emergency message. It was anchoring itself, like a lighthouse flickering into existence once every few weeks, using the only tool it still had, its signal. Further analysis of the electromagnetic data from Project Wakeglass showed Doppler inconsistency shifts that didn't match any known speed or direction. The conclusion was strange but consistent. The signal origin is not moving linearly through space, but rotationally as if orbiting a point outside our known reference. This matched, in a chilling way, the earlier observation by the Sandefjord captain that the Zéphyr was present but not visible, that it moved in and out, not forward and across. Then came the most compelling clue yet. An Indian deep-sea cable company, conducting unrelated repairs near the suspected Zéphyr field, reported that one of their seafloor monitors recorded a surface pressure change without any vessel physically present above. Pressure sensors registered a displacement consistent with a 5,000-ton ship, yet there was no wake, no thermal trace, and no radar detection. The phenomenon lasted 4 minutes, then reversed. What the data suggested was shocking. Something pressed down on the water, something massive then lifted, as if it had been sitting there, momentarily manifesting. The idea of intermittent materialization was no longer theoretical. Project Wakeglass published a preliminary report titled Phantom Tonnage: Evidence of Physical Presence Without Optical Confirmation. The final page of that document simply posed a question. What if the Zéphyr never left? What if it's still sailing, just not entirely in our version of time? This brought in physicists, not sailors, not signal analysts, but specialists in temporal topology. They began exploring the notion of looped time layers where a specific region, like the Perak Shelf Corridor, might act like a resonant cavity, amplifying and rebounding energy, signal, and even mass. It was fringe science, but no longer ignorable. One researcher compared it to a vinyl record with a scratch. If the needle keeps skipping back to a groove, the music loops. The song still exists in its entirety, but the listener is trapped in one repeating bar. What if the Zéphyr was caught in that groove? And what if the messages were its attempt to nudge the needle forward? The implications were staggering. If a man-made object, let alone a crew, could remain caught in such a pocket, then everything from material decay to memory perception might be affected. But no theory explained why now. Why was the signal growing clearer? Why were more ships detecting echoes? Why was the water responding? One theory, unsettling in its simplicity, proposed this. The cycle is degrading. Whatever held the Zéphyr in stasis is weakening. And as that grip loosens, so too might the barrier between the ship and the world it once knew. Near the end of that winter, another signal came through. Shorter, fainter, but with a new word. Coordinate mismatch, requesting replacement pattern. To the researchers, it meant only one thing. The Zéphyr was trying to find its way home, but the map had changed, and it didn't know where home was anymore. Not long after the 2022 radio transmission from ZPH-421 stunned maritime authorities, a discovery on land would quietly intensify the mystery and shift its center of gravity away from the sea towards something far stranger. In a modest archives wing at the National Maritime Library in Penang, a junior librarian was conducting a digitization project. Among the boxes of logs, manifest duplicates, and maintenance invoices, she found a sealed envelope marked Z421, confidential, not for port release. It had no date, no official sender, only a faded wax stamp bearing a symbol that looked like a combination of a sextant and a compass, neither government nor military, at least not officially. Inside was a typed transcript. clearly a radio dialogue. The heading read, Tactical Relay Unscheduled Ping, the 12th of April 2007. Time 02:04 MYT. That was the exact time the Zephyr's final message was presumed to have been sent. But the dialogue in the transcript was not one-sided. It was a full back and forth between the Zéphyr and an unnamed relay station designated only as Control Echo. The conversation went as follows. Zéphyr. Engine response down 37%. Non-civilian cargo stable. Hull breach projected within 8 hours. Control Echo. Confirmed temporal reading. Is the anomaly active? Zéphyr. Intermittent. Loop confirmed. Guidance requested. Control. Echo. Refrain from manual override. Await extraction vector. Zéphyr. Crew stable. Memory drift within parameters. Awaiting. Then silence. No sign-off. No distress call. Just awaiting. This suggested something more complex than a shipwreck. The language temporal reading, loop confirmed. Memory drift was far beyond routine maritime vocabulary. It read like something experimental, almost clinical. More disturbingly, this communication never appeared in any official port or military communication logs. That meant either the relay control, ECHOAS, a classified node outside conventional infrastructure, or the transcript itself was fabricated by someone trying to imply a level of sophistication that didn't exist. But here's where it gets worse. In one of the message headers, a notation read, Cross-check RMSQ 3 array Perak North Pulse series. That phrasing exactly matched an experimental array that had been built quietly and under contractin 2006. It was known as the RMSQ-3, an ocean floor magnetic sensor net designed to measure real-time spatial anomalies for high-frequency submarine navigation. The project was never publicly disclosed, and the sensor grid was dismantled after a year. Official reason: data inconsistent with expected geophysical behavior. Inconsistencies like time loop echoes or transmissions that repeat before they are sent. Historians struggled to reconcile what this could mean. Could there have been a real-time awareness at the time of Zephyr's disappearance, that the ship was experiencing something non-linear? Something that could not be communicated through standard protocols? The phrase memory drift haunted analysts. It implied something deeply human perception failing to anchor, as if crew members were still mentally functional, but losing track of chronology. Like astronauts on a deep mission, or patients caught in repeating dream cycles, one neurologist specializing in hyper-isolation environments weighed in during a closed maritime forum. He said, if a crew were exposed to sustained temporal displacement, say time looping or dilation, they might retain core memories, but lose the ability to assign sequence. To them, 2007 and 2022 could feel like the same hour. If true, the Zephyr's repeating message wasn't a glitch. It was a check-in, a system query, a heartbeat, a ghost still thinking it's alive. The academic community, already cautious, began to fracture. Some researchers believed the transcript was authentic proof that the ship had never truly disappeared, but had been diverted into an experiment gone wrong. Others maintained it was a hoax elaborate but meaningless without hard evidence. Yet something deeper stirred. The librarian who found the transcript, after it was quietly turned over to authorities, left a single note in the archive's submission form. It read, "I don't know if this is real, but the moment I held it, the air in the room paused. And when the document was tested routine, ink aging, paper density, and typing machine imprinted revealed something nobody expected. The ink used was a carbon-based ribbon last manufactured in 1997, discontinued globally in 2002. But the envelope itself? It bore microplastic traces, not developed until 2009. 2 different timelines. One message, and a ship that seems to occupy them both. In early 2024, a storm approached the Strait of Malacca, seasonal monsoon, nothing unusual. But something happened that night that turned weather into witness. The cargo vessel MV Lorindra, a Panamanian flagged freighter, en route from Jakarta to Penang, passed near the Perak Shelf during peak rain and low visibility. The captain later described it as the kind of night when even the sea seems to fold inward. At 2:06 a.m., just as the sky cracked open with thunder, the bridge crew reported a brief but total blackout. Instruments failed. Interior lights dimmed, and all navigational data went dark. For exactly 187 seconds. But it wasn't the power failure that unnerved them. It was the light that appeared outside the port window. A soft blue glow horizontal low over the sea, moving against the storm. A shape, massive, barely visible but unmistakable. The silhouette of a ship, no lights, no markings, drifting quietly across the waves, but leaving no wake. The crew said it passed within a kilometer. One officer tried to film it using a phone camera. The device froze and later wouldn't power on. Another, using a compact analog camera, managed to take 2 photos through a fogged lens. When developed, the second image overexposed and blurred showed a long form slicing across the water, and on its hull, just barely readable, the letter Z followed by 3 digits, 421. The image wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough. This was not folklore anymore. The Zéphyr had crossed into visibility. That same night, the Malaysian Meteorological Department recorded an unusual pulse on their ionospheric monitoring stations. Not a lightning strike, not interference. A tight, rhythmic burst of energy that lasted 43 seconds, centered on the exact coordinates where the Lorindra logged their blackout. This was the first time the Zéphyr's appearance and a natural energy anomaly were documented simultaneously. In the following weeks, something changed in the Zéphyr's signals. They no longer repeated verbatim. New words emerged, new phrases. One recording captured by a passing tugboat contained the phrase, "Course drift increasing, proximity breach likely." This suggested that not only was the ship becoming more present, it might be slipping through. The term proximity breach began appearing across logs. To some, it implied nothing. To others, especially those who had studied the 2007 experimental payload, it implied that the field, the barrier between the ship's current position and our own world, was starting to break. Then came the phenomena on land. In coastal villages near Pulau Pangkor, Residents reported hearing faint ship horns at nigh-tolled low tones that echoed for miles, despite no ships being within visible range. A few reported seeing ghost lights on the horizon, lined up like mast lanterns, only to vanish as they drew close. One fisherman claimed he saw a figure standing on the water solid, unmoving, silhouetted against moonlight. When he shouted, it turned, and then simply blinked out like a switch turned off. To some, these were hallucinations, tired minds reading too much into salt, air, and fog. But to others, they were signs. Especially when a small team of amateur radio enthusiasts from IPO picked up a distinct signal, broadcast in shortwave a band the Zéphyr had never used. The voice, when filtered and cleaned, said, "Crew status degrading. Time coherence unstable. Pattern drift confirmed. Please advise." This was not a distress call. It was a diagnostic. Like a machine attempting to run a check on itself, still methodical, still measured, even as it fell apart. Researchers working with Project Wake Glass analyzed the signal structure and found something remarkable. The waveform carried a signature identical to an early type of naval memory protocol used in encrypted satellite communications between 2003 and 2006. But here's the problem. That memory protocol required a closed-loop power source to maintain it across cycles. That meant the Zéphyr had not only survived, but had somehow kept its core systems active for nearly 17 years. No ship, adrift and abandoned, could have done that, unless it had never truly been abandoned. Unless it had been maintaining a Lupin internal world, cycling again and again, waiting for a return vector, waiting for coordinates that never came. One physicist proposed that the Zéphyr may have entered what he called a feedback entrapment, where time folds inward and creates a miniature cycle like a tiny universe with its own rules. He likened it to a skipping track on a digital file that eventually corrupts and bleeds into nearby systems. If the Zéphyr's loop is breaking, he said, then what's bleeding into us is memory. Not just sound, but presence. The sea, long a place of forgetting, was now becoming a place of remembering. And it was remembering too much, too fast. And the Zéphyr, once a footnote in maritime history, was now not only trying to come back, it was beginning to arrive. With mounting sightings and increasingly structured transmissions, the Zéphyr was no longer treated as an unsolved disappearance, but as an active phenomenon. International observers began quietly arriving in the region under various guises. Research vessels, cable maintenance crews, environmental surveys. Each came equipped with high-gain antenna arrays, oceanographic sensors, and in one case, a full-spectrum imaging satellite, repositioned temporarily over the Strait of Malacca. And then, something unprecedented happened. On the night of the 8th of April, 2024, an AI-managed listening post, operated by the Dutch Institute for Marine Signal Behavior, housed deep in a research complex on Texel Island, detected a burst of full duplex communication. This meant the signal didn't just transmit, it showed real-time input and response lag, like a conversation conducted across a fragmented channel. The origin was triangulated to the Perak anomaly zone. The receiver? Unknown. But the content? ZPH-421 acknowledging uplink attempt. Memory stream active. Loop friction increased. Reintegrating current timestamp. Please confirm present year. The line that shook the entire team was the last one. It wasn't a ghost call. It was a query for temporal confirmation. The Zéphyr was, it seemed, aware of time's passage. It had been watching, calculating drift, fighting degradation of information and self. This message set off a frenzy. Project Wakeglass partnered with a coalition of independent observatories to attempt a structured response using phased VLF, very low frequency, pulses, to simulate simple confirmation phrases. They kept it basic. 2024 confirmed link attempt in progress. What happened next remains under NDA in most official reports, but insiders leaked key details. At 2:03 a.m., just as the reply was broadcast, a massive pressure displacement was recorded across 6 hydrophones anchored to the seafloor near the Zéphyr corridor. Water temperature rose by 1.2 degrees Celsius in under a minute. A long cylindrical shadow passed under 2 buoys, each 7 kilometers apart, with 0 wake. And then something impossible. One of the buoys, equipped with a basic optical camera for environmental observation, captured frames of a physical object surfacing briefly just as lightning struck the waterline. The image, a rustless hull, a clean anchor chain, no crew in sight. But attached to the mast was a torn flag, white with 3 dark lines. The Zephyr's original flag, even more chilling, was the timestamp embedded in the photo's metadata. 2:04 a.m., the 8th of April, 2007. 17 years to the minute from the ship's last known radio log. Time, it seemed, had folded in on itself. The Zéphyr hadn't just sent messages. It had carried its moment with ETA's self-contained bubble of 2007 collapsing into present reality. And then the radio went dead again. No new signal came for 12 days. In that silence, researchers argued, some believed the message had drained the ship's last reserves. Others suggested the ship was attempting full reintegrating with a timeline that had shifted without it. And a few, especially those familiar with quantum echo theory, warned of something more alarming. If a vessel maintains a memory long enough to overwrite reality, one theorist wrote, then the past doesn't return to Uswe, return to it. That idea of reverse re-entry terrified many, because if the Zéphyr succeeded in stabilizing its loop, it might reset events tied to it. Not catastrophically, perhaps, but subtly, like déjà vu that lingers, or archived footage showing a detail that wasn't there the first time you watched it. Meanwhile, strange things were being reported far beyond the Strait. In a shipping museum in Hamburg, a vintage sextant began emitting low-frequency hums without power. It had belonged to a vessel that once rendezvoused with the Zéphyr in 2004. A retired crewman from the Artemis Ray woke from sleep speaking in ship codes he hadn't used since 2006 and didn't recall doing so. A customs clerk in Singapore discovered a freshly typed inventory slip marked ZPH-421, cargo secured, checksum OK. The paper was warm. The typeface didn't match any printer in the facility. Reality, it seemed, was not resisting the Zephyr's return. It was accommodating it. Perhaps this is how it happens, not in explosions, not in lightning, but in subtle rewrites, in slips of language, or waves that ripple the wrong direction. In ships, you remember only when they reappear, and in one line that keeps coming back, across radios, logs, and dreams. Extraction pending, awaiting coordinates. But whose extraction? Theirs or ours? As April deepened and signals faded, a new pattern emerged not from the sea, but from a freighter's dream. The MV Andalara, an aging Spanish vessel transiting from Madura to Klang, reported a crew-wide anomaly, unlike any on record. In the early hours of the 16th of April, 2024, 7 of the 14 crew members independently described waking from the same dream-shared hallucination of walking through narrow, unlit corridors below deck. Corridors, they insisted, were not part of their ship. What united them wasn't just the setting, it was the details. The scent of old engine grease, the sound of Morse code in the walls, and most distinctively, a plaque at the end of a hallway. ZPH-421, anchor release. Failed. Initially dismissed as fatigue, the event became harder to ignore when the ship's third engineer, a woman with no known interest in maritime lore, sketched the corridor from memory. Naval architects who later examined the drawing found it eerily consistent with the below-deck design of the Zéphyr layout, not accessible to the public and long presumed lost with the ship. At the same time, a strange electronic malfunction was reported in the Andalara's power room. For 6 minutes, the ship's navigation console showed a shadow vessel bearing no transponder ID, trailing them by 3 nautical miles. Then, without notice, it vanished. What's important is this. The Andalara was 160 kilometers north of the known anomaly zone. The Zéphyr was expanding. And then came something utterly inexplicable. A long-range surveillance satellite operated by a Japanese research group focused on weather tracking, captured thermal traces in the strait that looped. Literally looped. The satellite's infrared scan spanning a 15-minute cycle recorded a heat signature of a ship surfacing, moving, and then disappearing, only to reappear in the exact same location 5 minutes earlier, again and again. To some, it looked like a glitch. But data integrity confirmed the loop wasn't in the recording, it was in the phenomenon itself. It was as if the Zéphyr had become not a ship, but a recurring event. A memory the ocean couldn't stop replaying. And in that playback, more details began to show. Satellite pass number 7 of the thermal scan captured something new. Heat signatures within the shiptony moving shapes, regular and human-sized. Warm bodies. That's when someone asked the obvious question. If they're still alive, do they know they're repeating? The Zéphyr's crew, if still conscious, may have endured over 6,000 temporal resets by now. A life inside a moment, played on endless loop. That would mean they never left the Strait. They never died. They never advanced past that final hour, an existential trap flesh and thought caught between seconds, unable to decay, unable to forget. And still, the ship communicates. One analyst at Project Wakeglass noted a new behavior in the latest pulse, reversed Morse-not the pattern, but the entire waveform flipped backward, as if trying to reach listeners on the other side of something. When decoded, it contained only 4 words. We did not finish. A phrase as open-ended as it is chilling. What did they not finish? The transmission? The experiment? Their return? At this point, a haunting theory took root among the Wakeglass team. One member put it simply, what if the Zéphyr is not returning to us? What if we're being brought to it, drifted into its loop? It wasn't entirely metaphoric. With each new anomaly, more ships were reporting time discrepancies, unlogged positional jumps, and equipment behaving as if under an old protocol pre-2010 formats, legacy systems showing up in fully updated consoles. It was as if the timeline the Zéphyr once belonged to was beginning to overwrite pieces of our own, not violently, not suddenly, but like fog creeping over glass. And now, more civilians were beginning to report sightings from shore beacon flashes at sea that vanished upon approach, or quiet humming noises in the early hours before dawn. But the most telling sign came from an old lighthouse. On the eastern tip of Penang Island, a decommissioned lighthouse long dormant, power disconnected, was seen flashing its beacon. It had no fuel, no electricity, no staff, but several fishermen confirmed it blinked in slow, deliberate intervals, 3 longs, 1 short, 2 longs. When transcribed into Morse, it translated to one word: repeat. The Strait was no longer hiding the Zéphyr. It was becoming it. By late April 2024, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The Zéphyr had not merely survived. It had become something else, a rhythm, embedded in reality, a kind of maritime echo pulsing louder with each cycle. But then, something finally changed. It happened aboard the KRI Teluk Bahang, an Indonesian Navy patrol vessel operating just east of the Perak Shelf. The ship was conducting standard radar sweeps when it intercepted a new kind of signal. Not Morse code, not broadcast pulses, but what seemed like a coordinated data packet. Digital, structured, encoded in a 2007 naval protocol that had long been retired. The message was short. Vector confirmed. Cycle ending. Request visual verification. The naval team acted quickly. They launched a quadcopter drone outfitted with infrared and night vision optics, sending it directly toward the coordinates embedded in the signal. What it captured was surreal. There, floating motionless on perfectly still waters, was the Zéphyr. Fully intact, deck clean, no visible rust or decay. Anchored, though, the chain vanished into the ocean, as if suspended on memory rather than gravity. And aboard, faint movement. Shadows passing across cabin windows, though no one was clearly visible. What caught everyone's attention wasn't the ship itself. It was the sky above it. Directly overhead, a narrow column of clouds spiraled downward, not a storm, not natural wind. It was as if something unseen was turning the atmosphere itself, drawing it inward, focusing it, and the water around the ship was unnaturally flat, as if a dome had pressed onto the sea, holding the world still. The drone's camera caught the Zephyr's nameplate, freshly painted, gleaming under moonlight. Then it saw something else. A hatch opened. A single figure emerged on deck. The image resolution was poor, but the body language was unmistakable. The person was waving, not in panic, not in distress, just waving. Slowly, repeatedly, like someone expecting to be recognized. And at that moment something happened that should not have been possible. A time code glitch appeared on the drone's footage. For exactly 41 seconds, the internal timestamp loop switching from April 2024 back to April 2007, then returning again. The camera clock, synchronized to GPS atomic time, had no reason to do that. And yet, when reviewed frame by frame, the footage from that 41-second gap was crisper, warmer in tone, and bore a different time of day early morning light, not moonlit dusk. It was like the drone had momentarily entered the Zephyr's time bubble scene what it remembered instead of what was present. And when the footage returned to normal, the ship was gone. No splash, no movement. The drone's visual telemetry showed only an empty ocean. But the data packet had been real. The timestamp had been real. And something had waved. For the first time in 17 years, confirmation had arrived not of a ghost, not of a mystery, but of presence. The Wake Glass team issued their final report shortly after. We no longer believe the Zéphyr is an isolated phenomenon. We believe it is an inflection point, a moment trapped in recursion, now resolving. Its appearance has aligned too closely with lunar cycles, geolocation memory, and transmission decay rates to be random. Whatever boundary once held it apart is collapsing. What's left unresolved is why now? Why did the cycle begin to degrade in 2023, after nearly 2 decades of stability? Was it human interference or constant listening, our questions, our pursuit that tugged the Zéphyr back? Or was it the ship itself, trying to surface, aware that its hour had long passed but unable to let go? A naval historian, speaking anonymously, offered a poetic possibility. Maybe the Zéphyr isn't stuck. Maybe it's been waiting for just the right observer to look at it not as lost, but as something meant to return. And if so, what happens when enough people believe it back into existence? Could memory alone restore a vessel? Could time itself, softened by repetition, forgive a moment and let it re-enter? As of now, the waters of the Strait remain quiet again. No signals, no pulses, just a stillness that feels too deliberate. But coastal radio operators still leave one channel open, just in case. Because late at night, sometimes, the static pulses in threes. And sometimes, it ends with one simple word: present.